Well, I'm very glad to be with you today. I'm going to turn on my webcam just for a moment so you can see who's talking at you. Hello, I'm Patsy Egan, and I'm joining you from St. Paul, Minnesota. If you are in an international setting, you might not know where that is. St. Paul is the capital of Minnesota. We're about 6 hours west of Chicago and a few hours from the Canadian border, where I work in adult education. So just a little bit about me. Um, I work in adult education, which means I work only with teachers of adults. And while the work that I'm presenting today certainly would be applicable across all sorts of different contexts, for the most part, I'll be speaking to it from some adult examples. And I work in a university called Hamline University here in St. Paul. And my work concerns doing professional development for teachers of adult learners. So I am involved with language and reading and writing and career pathways work and employability to help our adult students get where they want to go next in their lives. So today I'm very excited to be teaching on this subject. This is project-based learning and thinking of it as a pathway to language literacy and employability. So we are going to get started with that topic, and I'm just delighted to have been asked to present on this. So the objectives then for today's webinar are the following. Hopefully by the end of our time together, you'll have the ability to describe project-based learning with some examples. Also to connect what I'm going to abbreviate in places PBL, or project-based learning, with preparing English learners for college, careers, and deeper community involvement. Hopefully by the end of the webinar, you'll be able to articulate some key benefits and challenges of project-based learning, and also access some further resources for getting started with project-based learning, or in deepening or strengthening some of the project-based learning that you may already do in your teaching context. So for those of you who work with adult English learners, you already know this, but there is a lot to juggle. And I'm sure no matter who you're working with, that is true. But some of the things that adult teachers are juggling are, for example, basic skills. So teaching language, literacy, and math. We're also responsible for helping students to develop soft skills, or sometimes we call that employability skills. So that is like critical thinking, or navigating systems, or effective communication, problem solving, helping students to develop learning strategies. So sometimes we call these soft skills. You may have heard them referred to as 21st century skills, but they're kind of hard to define, but really make or break skills as far as our students go, and helping them to navigate what's next in their trajectory, whether it's a career or a college, or just having deeper community involvement. In addition to basic skills and soft skills, adult educators as well as teachers have small children, of course, are already working with digital literacy. And so integrating the digital literacy and technology that we know our students need to get ahead in today's society. And then also, of course, our teachers are working with content knowledge. So it could be academic content, social studies, math, science. It could be career content. Of course, when we're talking about adult learners, they need family sustaining work. They need to be able to support themselves and their families. Sometimes they're caring for older relatives and such, as well as small children. So work is very key to the world of adult education, and in fact, very much part of how it's organized here in the United States, and in particular is around workforce systems and how to get our students into and sustain in meaningful and family sustaining careers. Another piece of it, of course, is around resettlement. So for our adult English learners, they are immigrants and refugees to the United States. In my context, and they are in need of getting involved with their communities, advocating for themselves and their families, and getting everything that adults have to do done every day. So part of these questions that I'll be thinking about then is, how can we put it all together? Like, how do we weave together that basic skills, the language, literacy, and math, soft skills, and digital literacy, and content knowledge into our teaching? It's a lot, right? It's a lot to juggle. It's a lot to kind of keep organized into some sort of way that makes sense for our learners. And so I'm thinking of project-based learning as what I'm calling an instructional basket. So it's a container, something that can hold all of it, right? So that's how I'm going to refer to it a couple of times during the webinar today, as this instructional basket, meaning a way to organize our teaching and learning so that we can fit all of these different skills into the daily experiences of our students. So let's just start with a couple of definitions, be sure we're all on the same page here. So as far as what is project-based learning, well, it's an instructional approach. It's a way to manage instruction, a way to organize instruction, and it really has to do with coming up with a line of inquiry, some real world topic, some sort of question that's interesting and useful to our students so that we can then pull from that real world topic and get students to do some real work in our classrooms. So part of the work is having authentic goals and tasks. So some sort of project that's tied to the immediate lives of our students. So in project-based units of instruction, there's a result of some sort of product. So it's defined broadly. It could be a report, it could be a demonstration, it could be a video, it could be a poster, a pamphlet, a presentation of some kind. So there's lots of different options for what that kind of product might be. But one of the tenets of project-based learning is that at the end of a unit of instruction, there's something tangible to see, something that the students have created. So it could be elaborate, like a school garden or a community event, or it could be really small, just a poster for the classroom wall, or maybe a brief presentation to a classmate. So what does it look like? Well, project-based learning is very interactive. It's engaging. You'll see students really talking to each other and working together. It's also often very messy. So it is not a super linear way of doing things. And one of the roles of a teacher doing project-based learning is that they kind of have to be okay with that mess time and again, because it's gonna not kind of be as straightforward perhaps as other ways of organizing our teaching. And part of the role also for teachers is that they really do have to step back from being in front of the classroom as the bearer of all knowledge to really being an orchestrator of the learning, a facilitator of the conditions wherein that learning can take place. So in completing project-based units, students have to employ a wide array of basic skills, again, those language, literacy, and math skills, as well as soft skills like the effective communication, collaboration, creative thinking, critical thinking, self-management is another big one. Those projects are typically multidisciplinary, and they can be related to building learners' knowledge or community needs. They can be related to careers or the workforce, or academic subjects like social studies or science. So that's part of the appeal of this approach, of course, is no matter what context you're working in, and really no matter what age of your learner or what level of your learners, you can get this done. You can do this, and you can have really interesting, meaningful projects that your students are engaged in. It's a rigorous and engaging approach, and it develops those literacy, language, and math skills, and also, in the context of adult education, prepares them for college or careers. So in our time together, of course, we don't have a lot of time, but while we're on the webinar, I'll be sharing 2 examples of project-based learning. And one of the key questions that I'm going to hold and just keep thinking about is, how do we keep project-based learning manageable and yet still meaningful? So like I said, project-based learning can be a messy process, right? And we'll see an example that we'll see the end product and it looks fantastic, but boy, it was not a straight line to get there necessarily. We also want it to be meaningful, like the students need to be able to get something out of it every single day. So I'll keep coming back to that question. The 2 examples I'm going to share are different in that one is more extensive and it goes over several weeks. It happens to be an example from low-level adult ESL. It certainly would not have to take place in that particular setting. And then the second example I'll share is more of a self-contained one-day, one-class session kind of project. It happens to be with low-intermediate adult ESL. Again, it certainly would not have to be. So I just wanted to give those 2 examples in a moment because it can show how elaborate it can be, or really how very small and yet still meaningful those 2 things can be. And I'm grateful for Kyoko and Drew have put a couple of things in the chat that we can look at them in a little bit, but I'll be sure and share some resources. So in a minute, I'll share those and you'll be able to see some of the things that can help us to get started. Let me click away here. Okay, So one thing I'm going to show is this kind of more elaborate school garden project. And this one comes to my colleague, Mary Zamacona. She teaches here in St. Paul at Open Door Learning Center, part of Literacy Minnesota. And this was a school garden. And so they happen to be in a setting where the school takes place in a part of a church that they rent space, and they're able to have a garden in the yard of the church. And this was an extensive project that spanned several weeks. A project-based unit of instruction. It took place here in town, and they were able to create videos of the school garden at the end of the summer. So they tended this garden, they designed it first, of course, they tended it all summer, they harvested, they did all sorts of great language and literacy activities with the garden, and then later they made these videos, and that's the project I want to share with you in a little bit. So Mary, the teacher, had what she called a jobs class of low-level adult students, and she led them through this process of filming, writing, editing, and showcasing their own videos about this garden. And then each student identified a few vegetables in the garden, described how to cook at least one of them, and then shared why he or she thinks the garden is important. And so again, at the end of the webinar, I'll show a website where you can find this project completely written up with all of the notes and such, and links to some of the example videos that students created, including materials for the unit and some rubrics for assessment. The alignment of this unit really does show some of the soft skills that were worked on. So some of those critical thinking, navigating systems, and self-management skills that students were using, as well as the career and college readiness standards that students had to use in order to get this work done. So I'm going to try and show, let's see if I can show a quick, you won't be able to hear it, and it's really okay. So we're just going to be okay with the fact that you can't hear it, but you'll get a sense of what the students did. And again, the students not only created the garden, they created these videos. Let me see if it'll show here. So again, I know you can't hear it, but this woman is simply showing the garden, and she's welcoming the people watching the video to the space, and then describing a little bit of the garden. She's showing the herbs. There's some cute music in the background that when I give you the link, you'll be able to see. I'll just give you a moment to get a sense of what the students did here. So I will be, yeah, as Kyoko posted just now, I've posted, or thank you very much. She's posted the link to the video if you're curious as to what it sounded like, but that gives you a sense of what was involved. These are low-level adult ESL students. This particular area of the city has a lot of students from Southeast Asia who are refugees and immigrants to our community here, and some of them have a lot of gardening experience and some of them don't have any. And so there was an interesting mix of people who were really experienced at this and some who were brand new, and everyone was new to making videos. And so that was really the core of this project, was harnessing some of their skills and interests, for example, in gardening, but adding a whole new layer, which was in creating this video, adding music, adding sound, adding a script, and working together to get it done. And so some of the things they had to do then included making a plan for the garden itself, planting and tending it throughout the summer, and then they harvested and they chose a vegetable for a recipe. And then with a partner or a couple of partners, in some cases, they filmed a video showcasing it, showcasing this garden. And then the students used iVideo, an app, to edit the video, and they added music and titles. So some of our young learners, of course, are very quick at this and do this all the time. Some of our older learners, perhaps not as often. So this was a project that did require quite a lot of digital literacy. So as far as what the students were asked to do, they worked in groups, and you can see the teacher assigned them different jobs. This is just a snippet from one of their handouts from the project. She put them into groups such as one person or two was the job or the camera operator and was responsible for checking out the camera, recording it, returning that iPad. somebody who was a tech expert who helped with all the technology and the editing. Somebody was the actor. You saw the woman in in the video who was showing the vegetables. They had to have an actor designated in their group. And then a script writer. Somebody needed to write the script for the movie and decide what was going to be said. So just take a second, think of all the different skills that are happening with these different duties to get this project done, let alone, of course, all the things that had to happen up to the point where they actually filmed it. What I'd like you to do is we're going to try out one of the functions of the webinar here. If you can find the question box, there might be a little arrow next to it. And I'd like you to open that up and then see if you can type in there what skills are being taught or practiced in this project. They might be basic skills. They might be soft skills like critical thinking or collaboration. They might be digital literacy skills. Could be content knowledge. So let's just give that a second. Go ahead and see if you can use the question box. We're experimenting with this new platform, but let's try it and get a couple of answers from folks. So I am not able to see any of those, but maybe Kyoko or Drew, maybe you can? All right, now I'm seeing some of these. So writing, speaking, coordinating, yeah, thank you. Okay, now I'm seeing them. There are a lot of opportunities for real life practice. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Oh, there's a comment that this might work well in a teaching of business English. Great. A lot of vocabulary, waking up their creativity. I love that response. Thank you. Vocabulary for sure. Using technology, communicating clearly. I know you can't see all of your colleagues' responses, but there are some really great ones here. So let me just capture some of them. Teamwork. Oh, teamwork came up several times. Group team management, absolutely. They're using digital literacy, what could help them in future jobs, absolutely. Um, yep, a lot of video editing skill, which could come up in a workplace, for example. The process even of just borrowing the equipment from school, absolutely. So that's like managing materials, making sure you know how to get it out, how to put it back, making sure troubleshooting if it doesn't work, all of those things. Oh, those are some fantastic responses. Thank you so much. All right, well, if you feel free to keep sharing, but I think we've captured a lot of wonderful ideas there. Thank you. I'm going to show another project now, and this one is much smaller scale. So in this project, it doesn't take place over several weeks or months. It's really just a one-day project. And I wanted to contrast these because so often we think of project-based learning as being this big, elaborate, hard to manage thing. And it can be, but it also could be something much smaller scale. So in this particular project, students are thinking about where they can buy healthy food at a low cost. And this comes from my colleague, Leah Olson, who also works here in St. Paul. And this topic came up in her class because she heard them talking about it. Like, where do you go? Oh, I go to Target. Or where do you go? I go to Cub Foods, or I go to Aldi. So she heard them talking about it. They wanted to kind of explore this topic together because she knew it would be of interest to them. And so what she did was design a project that included these tasks. They had to design a meal for 4 people. It could be breakfast, lunch, or dinner. They needed to create a poster with all the items needed to buy that meal, write down all the prices, and calculate the total cost of the meal, and then present that poster to the class. So this just, it was one class time. There was a couple of hours spent on this. And what she did the day before was go around to various stores and grab advertisements. So in our context, they have often at the front of the store near the door, there's a very colorful flyer which shows what's on sale that week and what people might want to use to get the best prices for their groceries. And so the students studied flyers from 4 local grocery stores. And then in teams, one team per store, they then designed a meal for a family of 4 and calculated the cost. So this is an excerpt from what she actually gave the students. She said, today we're going to answer the question, where can we buy foods for a healthy meal at the lowest cost? And then she says, we will research the cost of healthy foods at several different stores. You'll notice this is done in very student-friendly language, right? So these are her objectives, but she's doing it for the students, being very transparent about what they're going to do and why. And she's couching it all in this important kind of essential question of where can we buy foods for a healthy meal at a low cost. Number 3, she then says we're going to calculate the cost of the meal. So you can see she's embedding some math into this work. So it's not just language, not just literacy, not just life skills of the community and finding the right place to go shop, but also the math of figuring it out, how much you're going to need to spend. And then finally, choosing which store has the healthiest foods at the lowest cost. And then she further gives them these steps. So one of the things I really appreciate about this project is it's very transparent. It shows them exactly what they're going to do and why, and the steps and what they're working on. And that is just so important, particularly with adult learners. And that is in keeping with adult learning theory. We know students learn best when they know what they're working on and why, and can actively speak about that. So she says, you're going to answer this question. How much will it cost to prepare a healthy meal for a family of 4? You're going to make a poster and you're going to present the poster to the class. So already you can sense I'm going to ask you in a couple minutes what kinds of skills they're working on. So you might already have some ideas. And then the learning goals she lists down below. Of course, those 5 make good sense. Ask and answer questions about buying healthy foods, choosing food options, using resources to find information, calculating the cost of a meal, and then making and presenting that poster. And here's an example. I was able to be there for this lesson and I took a couple of pictures. So you'll see this was one team's poster. They found what they were going to serve. I hope you can read it okay on your screen. Some avocado, salad, chicken, some coconut milk, eggs, and then they calculated the cost. I think I have one more example on the next slide here. Here you go. Here's another one from another store. And you can see how much they spent for their healthy meal. So let's find that question box. What are they working on, right? Of course, they're working on foods and vocabulary around foods. That's sort of the obvious thing, but what else? What other basic skills, soft skills, content knowledge, or digital literacy are these students working on in doing this one-day healthy food project? I'll go ahead and let you answer that question in the question box. Yeah, I'm seeing some responses like all the skills, yes, and some things, the 21st century skills, describing, explaining, yeah, arriving to an agreement, yes, thank you. Um, mhm. I'm seeing some things around engaging with the community, figuring out where to go, cardinal and ordinal numbers, yeah, categorizing information, a lot of collaboration, absolutely, thank you for that. Working in a team, yep, figuring out who's going to read, who's going to write, who's going to cut the pictures out, comparing and contrasting prices, yep, some computer skills perhaps, doing some basic grammar for sure. Okay, lots of excellent responses there. It's a lot of creativity happening as well. Oh, you've hit on all the things. Yes, thank you so much for all these wonderful responses. There are far too many for me to just describe, but let me just read off a couple more ideas. A lot of social skills, figuring out what's cost effective, opportunities to visit stores they may not have visited before, opportunities to get advice from their peers. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, thank you so much for all of those great responses. I appreciate that. Okay, so I do want to go through a couple of things that can help us get started with this process. So in project-based learning, now that you've seen a couple of examples, one that's more extensive and one that's a little more self-contained, you can see that there's a line of inquiry or I like to think of it as a thread, like some sort of thread that ties it all together, or something that's woven throughout it at that essential question. The last one would have been around, of course, finding low-cost foods for a family meal. In the previous example, talking about a school garden and its impact on students, right? So having some sort of topic, something that's worth talking about, that's worth reading about, that's worth spending time on, of course, is essential, particularly for adult learners. We do need to have some sort of plan and some sort of product at the end, right? In order for it to be a project, there has to be something tangible at the end, but it could be a speech, it could be a presentation, it could be a poster, it could be something the students have created or painted or something of that sort as well. You do need a schedule. Projects can go on forever if you don't wrap them up, right? And sometimes projects go on far too long. So having some sort of timeline that's flexible because, we're working with humans here, but that also offers some guidance and some structure to the work. Project-based learning happens with tasks and it happens in teams. So that's another important thing to remember is that we are encouraging collaboration by giving a shared goal for a group of students. And then product and performance. So students are creating a product or there's some sort of like sharing, like typically in project-based learning, there's a means by which they're sharing what they learned with other teams in the classroom or maybe with another class next door. Sometimes I've seen classes present, for example, to staff, like the teacher might bring in a couple of people from the office and say, would you mind just being the audience for my students for a couple of minutes, and thereby giving them an audience, which is important for all kinds of good reasons. And then finally, offering the students some sort of evaluation and reflection. How did it go? How was it working together? What went well? What didn't? What could we do differently next time? Which is an important piece. So many of the things that you mentioned in the chat box earlier are things that have been named in the literature around project-based learning as well. This list happens to come from Dr. Nell Duke. She's with the University of Michigan, and she writes extensively about the benefits of project-based learning. And some of the things she lists are here on the screen. And you can see that these very much overlap with other lists, for example, around employability skills. If you've ever worked with an employability skills framework or a soft skills framework or 21st century skills, they really are all referring to roughly the same kind of thing. Creativity, problem solving, flexibility, dealing with others is a big one, right? That's social and cross-cultural skills. Having leadership, having some responsibility, being able to be self-directed. So all of those things can creep up in a well-designed project. So one way I like to think of it with this instructional basket is that, of course, yes, you're working on English, you're working on literacy, but you're also working on academic content knowledge of some kind. You could be working on science content or social studies content. You could be working on something career focused. It could be a project around health careers, for example, if your students are interested in pursuing nursing, or it could be something around business, as someone mentioned in the chat. If they're working with students who are all working within the same company, for example, the project could be very much linked to their daily work. And then, of course, those employability or soft skills. And what project-based learning does is offer some sort of instructional basket in which you can hold all of those important tasks for your students. So some advice, because it can be scary to try this if you've never done it. My advice is these three things. As you sit down with your coffee and your notebook to get started, one is to be flexible. Also to do what you can and to enlist some help. So as with any teaching endeavor, challenges are simply part of the work. And some of the concerns I hear from adult educators, because that's who I work with in particular, are around what we like to call turbulent attendance, which means your students don't necessarily come all the time, right? And so that can be a challenge when you're trying to do a cohesive project. Another challenge is around a multi-level. If your students are not speaking and listening and working in English at the same level or even roughly the same level, pulling off a project can be a challenge. These are real, to be certain, but it's often difficult to have a coherent project when you're not sure who's going to come every day, right? Other concerns might stem from not having enough class time with your learners or constraints such as funding, if you're trying to do something more elaborate. Perhaps a lack of paid preparation time. That's a complaint in particular in adult education, where teachers are often not paid very much, if anything, besides the hours in which they're present with students. And also access to technology. A lot of adult education happens in places where there isn't very reliable Wi-Fi, for example, or perhaps there isn't access to computers or iPads, and that can affect the kind of projects that you have and that are available to your students. They're real, but there are ways to work around them. So as you sit down to think about a project-based learning, I do encourage you to be flexible and to also consider the scale of your project. It does not have to be a big elaborate thing, right? As we saw in the food prices example. Um, there are often opportunities for teacher pivots, as I mentioned, so a way to kind of rethink perhaps what you're going to do, and also to find some help. So get some volunteers or some staff members or some higher level students to help you out. Someone in the chat mentioned that teenagers would be particularly helpful here. Absolutely. See if you can find some folks who might be particularly helpful if you're doing, for example, a gardening project. Maybe there's some retired folks in the neighborhood who are available during the day to help out. Or if you're doing something very high tech, maybe someone's got a couple of teenagers on spring break who can come over and help out with that, for example. Just a couple of slides to close us out here. What do the experts say? Well, Betsy Parrish, who quite literally wrote the book on teaching adult English learners, and she has this new book available from Cambridge just in the last few months. She writes project-based learning is an approach that allows for maximum learner involvement and choice in the learning process. Learners choose a topic of interest or concern to them and then direct their learning through inquiry, research on a topic, and collaboration with others. So pointing out many of the things that you all pointed out in the chat box. Another expert in this field is around culturally relevant pedagogy, and Gloria Ladson-Billings of the University of Wisconsin writes, culturally relevant teachers work hard to help students engage in meaningful projects that solve problems that matter to their lives. They pose powerful questions about social, cultural, economic, political, and other problems living in a democracy. So projects can be very powerful. They can seem very everyday, but the act of putting students together to work in teams toward a shared goal is in fact a very powerful one that prepares our students for all kinds of real life work. If you're looking to get started, there is one resource in particular, and it's also, their PDF is available in your handout section, and I would direct you to it. It's called Meeting the Language Needs of Today's Adult English Language Learner. It's from the LINKS, which is our national literacy network. It's in particular worth downloading because there's some digital links that might be helpful to you. So even if you don't work with adults, don't let the name fool you. This will be helpful for younger learners as well. And I would direct you to pages 13 through 18, specifically has a section on teaching through projects for rigorous instruction. And then there's an additional project idea around construction careers that might be of interest, and that's on page 9. There are lots of things to click on as you download and listen. There are testimonials from teachers and lots of other good things in here. So something in your handouts to download and take a look at. A couple of just additional resources to let you know about. One is the Atlas ABE Project-Based Learning Resource Library. Atlas is the project that I direct here in St. Paul. It stands for Adult Basic Education Teaching and Learning Advancement System. And we have a small but growing project-based learning library that you can check out. And then another tremendous resource I recommend is the Buck Institute for Education, and that's the pblworks.org site. So another, just a great place to get started with a lot of great information. I am going to pause here, and I thank Kyoko for putting a couple of those links in the chat box. I appreciate that. I'll just stop here and see if there are questions.
Hi, thank you, Patsy. I think we had a couple of questions about whether project-based learning would work in a one-on-one setting instead of a classroom.
Oh, that's a great question. And the answer is yes, of course it can. One of the benefits of it is quite flexible, right? So you can, when you're working with just one student or even one or two students, you can really design it for the student in particular and what their interests are. So that absolutely is a way to go. The piece that you wouldn't, of course, get is the teamwork. They may not be able to use class time as a team, but you could certainly get them out into the community. They could be, doing a little research. They could be researching online. They could be out interviewing people and bring that back. A whole lot of ways to make this work with one-on-one students. The joy of it, I think, in particular, is you can tailor it to that student then. I'm not sure I can see the question, so if there's another one, Drew or Kyoko, I'll let you read them off.
Yep. We have one. Does this type of instruction fit certain types of courses more than others, like English for specific purposes, business English, or adult ed?
Yeah, it's a great question. I turned my webcam on so you can see who's answering your questions. Thank you for asking them. Um, again, I guess I would echo something I said earlier, which is I mean, depending on your line of inquiry, depending on the kind of the question that you're asking students to tackle, it can be adapted to anything, right? So if you're working on how to like navigating your community, you have a project around that. If you're working on business English, you know, you have a project that results in a presentation of some kind. And if you're working on digital literacy, for example, you want to be sure and embed that into the project. So there's a great deal of flexibility with this approach. The piece that I would direct you to if you have a chance to download the slides would just be that process where it says, you know, identify the line of inquiry or the essential question. What are the tasks? What are the teams? What's your rough schedule? What's the product going to be at the end? And then what are the means by which students are going to share what they've created, either with you, with someone else, or with each other? So the process can really be applied across contexts. Thanks for the question.
Great, thank you, Patsy. We
Yeah.
also have a couple of questions about boosting students' motivation and keeping their engagement while doing project-based learning. Some
Yeah.
students may feel like the teachers are making them do projects instead of enjoying them.
Well, I don't know what you mean. Yes, of course that happens. I can speak to that personally. My children happen to go to a project-based high school, and you can imagine there are projects they get very excited about, and there are projects that they do not get excited about. So this is consistent across age groups, of course. I think the key with that, as with many things, particularly when teaching adults, is offering a lot of choices. And so when students have choices, not only in the project they're working on, but in the exact role that they have, the results will be much better. So for someone who's really kind of into the techie end of things, letting them be in charge of the video shoot or editing, for example, in the garden one, that would be a great option to keep people engaged. And hopefully they'll dip their toes into some of those other skills as well. But if their main job can be something they're particularly interested in or want to get better at, that's a great way to go. You might have someone who does not want to be in the movie, right? If you're making like a video project, they don't want to be in front of the camera. Fine, they can do all kinds of things outside of that role as well. So one of the projects they outlined had the different job tasks and then the roles. And so students can pick and choose the kinds of things. You might have to nudge them a little to pick something they actually do need to work on. You don't want them to only do the thing they're already very good at. But if you can say, okay, do one thing you're really comfortable with and one thing that's going to be a challenge. The nice thing about working with adult learners, of course, is they're there for a reason. Motivation, typically not a huge deal. They're there because they want to be, not because anyone's making them be. Different in different contexts, and I do understand that, but certainly offering choices and letting them have some choices in the projects and the topics that they're studying is helpful as well.
Great. I think we have time for one last question before we
Sure.
end the webinar. And it was around how do you manage project-based learning in crowded classrooms when there's a lot of students to manage?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's going to be messy, right? I mean, that's my number one thing is like we just have to kind of make peace with the idea that it's not going to be quiet in your classroom when you're working in teams. It's also not going to go as planned a lot of the time, and we just kind of have to be okay with that. So that being said, there are certainly some things we can do to strategize and to try to help things go a little bit more smoothly. One is to have very defined tasks and schedules, right? And so I think the larger the class, the more kind of like task mastery we have to be and say, okay, I need this group to get this done on this date, and just be a little more directive about how we get the work done and when. Otherwise, it's just very chaotic, because as I'm sure you know if you work in that setting. Another idea, of course, is to scale back, right? It doesn't have to be a big elaborate thing, like do something smaller. Another great idea, of course, is to enlist volunteers. One of the joys of adult education in my context is there are a great number of community volunteers who will come in and help, and that can be a really terrific way to go as well. So have really specific groupings. How you're putting students together matters. Having higher level students or more self-directed students or people who've been in the country longer, for example, if you're in the US or another immigrant-based context, putting students who've been here longer and have just a little more familiarity with the community can be helpful if you're doing some sort of community outreach project as well. And pair them with someone who perhaps is newer to the context or to the class or to the city can be helpful as well. So any of those good classroom management skills will help out here. But if you're feeling like it might be overwhelming, maybe scale back and you know your context and your learners better than anyone.
Right, thank you. And I'm
You're
sorry we
welcome.
didn't get a chance to answer all your questions. There were some great ones that were coming in.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. So
Okay.
just again, we have recorded the session, and so we'll be sharing the link to the recording along with the certificate of attendance in about 1 to 2 weeks. So please keep your eye out for that email to come in your inbox. And if you can check your control panel under handouts, there are 2 PDFs. One are the slides that Patsy used today, and the other one is the document that she referenced during the webinar. So if you like, you can download them right now. And thank you again, and have a great rest of your day and an evening. If I know there's a lot of you who joined from
Across
other
the
parts of
ocean.
the
Yeah.
world.
All
Yeah,
right. Thank
across
you,
the
Egan.
ocean. All right, thank you again, Patsy.
Yeah, that's my pleasure. Thanks for your help today.
Bye.
Bye.